The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as crowds of tourists gathered behind the familiar black railings. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her camera strap and checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. This was her first trip to London, and she had planned every detail meticulously. The changing of the guard ceremony was at the top of her must-see list. Sarah was a 32-year-old teacher from a small town in Ohio. She had saved for 2 years to afford this dream vacation to England. Her students often heard her talk about British history and culture, and now she was finally experiencing it firsthand. The excitement bubbled inside her as she positioned herself for the best view of the ceremony. Standing tall and motionless near the palace gates was guard James Wellington. At 28 years old, James had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years. His red tunic was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat sat precisely on his head, and his boots gleamed in the morning light. To tourists, he appeared like a statue, unmoving and unapproachable. But behind his stoic expression, James was very much aware of everything happening around him. James had grown up in a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and his grandfather had been a guard at Windsor Castle. Following family tradition felt natural to him, though the reality of standing motionless for hours, while tourists took photos and sometimes tried to make him laugh or move, was more challenging than he had expected. The crowd around the palace grew larger as the ceremony time approached. Sarah found herself pushed closer to the front, her camera ready. She noticed families with children pointing excitedly at the guards, elderly couples reminiscing about their own visits decades ago, and young backpackers snapping selfies. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation and wonder. As Sarah watched James, she couldn't help but feel curious about the person behind the uniform. She wondered what it was like to stand so still for so long, what thoughts went through his mind, and whether he ever got tired or bored. Her teacher's instincts made her naturally curious about people and their stories. The ceremony began with the sound of drums and military commands echoing across the courtyard. The guards moved with precision and grace, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Sarah was mesmerized by the tradition and pageantry unfolding before her eyes. She took dozens of photos, trying to capture every detail. James had performed this ceremony hundreds of times, but he never lost appreciation for its significance. He understood that for many tourists, this moment represented a connection to centuries of British history and tradition. Despite the repetitive nature of his duties, he took pride in being part of something larger than himself. During a brief pause in the ceremony, Sarah noticed something that made her heart sink. An elderly gentleman standing near her began to sway slightly. His face had gone pale, and beads of sweat appeared on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The man's wife looked concerned and was gently supporting his arm. The crowd was packed tightly together, and Sarah realized the elderly man was struggling in the heat and crush of people. She looked around for help, but everyone seemed focused on the ceremony. The man's condition was clearly worsening, and his wife appeared increasingly worried. Without hesitation, Sarah moved closer to assist. She had basic first aid training from her teaching job and recognized the signs of someone who might faint or worse. The elderly woman gratefully accepted her help as they tried to create some space around the man. James, despite his obligation to remain at attention, had also noticed the commotion in the crowd. His training included awareness of crowd safety, and he could see that someone needed assistance. However, his position required him to maintain discipline and not break formation during the ceremony. The situation became more urgent as the elderly man's legs began to buckle. Sarah and his wife struggled to support him, but they needed more help. Other tourists nearby began to notice, but most seemed unsure of what to do or how to help without disrupting the formal ceremony taking place. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to figure out the best course of action. She could see that the man needed immediate medical attention, but she didn't want to cause a scene that might disrupt the ceremony or cause panic in the crowd. At the same time, she knew that someone's health and safety was more important than any tourist attraction. The elderly woman whispered to Sarah that her husband had a heart condition and sometimes experienced episodes like this. She seemed frightened and kept looking around desperately for help. Sarah realized that they needed to get him medical attention quickly and possibly call for emergency services. James watched the situation unfold from the corner of his eye, feeling torn between his duty to maintain position and his human instinct to help someone in distress. He had been trained to handle various situations that might arise during public ceremonies, but each circumstance required careful judgment about when and how to respond. The crowd around the struggling man began to shift and murmur as more people became aware of the medical emergency developing. Sarah knew that action needed to be taken quickly, but she felt overwhelmed by the situation and uncertain about the proper protocol in such a formal setting. As the ceremony continued around them, a critical moment was approaching that would test both Sarah's compassion and James's training. The elderly man's condition continued to deteriorate, and it became clear that someone would need to make a difficult decision about how to proceed. Sarah looked toward James, hoping that somehow he might be able to help or signal for assistance. She had no idea that her next action would create a moment that neither of them would ever forget, and that would challenge everything she thought she knew about duty, humanity, and the power of simple human connection. The elderly man suddenly collapsed, his legs giving way completely as his wife cried out in alarm. Sarah immediately knelt beside him, checking his pulse and trying to keep him conscious. The situation had escalated beyond what she could handle alone, and she knew they needed professional medical help immediately. The crowd around them began to panic slightly, with people pushing backward to give space while others pressed forward to see what was happening. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility as she tried to keep the man stable while his terrified wife held his hand and whispered reassuring words. James felt every muscle in his body tense as he watched the emergency unfold just meters away from his post. His military training had taught him to prioritize human life above all else, but his ceremonial duties required him to maintain position unless officially relieved or ordered to respond. The internal conflict was intense. Looking around desperately, Sarah spotted a police officer stationed near the palace entrance, but he was too far away and hadn't noticed the commotion yet. The ceremony was still in progress, with drums playing and commands being shouted, which masked the sounds of the medical emergency developing in the crowd. The elderly woman looked up at Sarah with tears in her eyes and said her husband had experienced a heart attack 2 years earlier. She was afraid this might be another one, and she didn't know what to do. Sarah tried to remain calm and reassuring while internally panicking about the seriousness of the situation. James made a split-second decision that would change everything. Despite being in the middle of a formal ceremony with hundreds of tourists watching and photographers capturing every moment, he took a small step forward from his position. It was barely noticeable to most observers, but it was a significant breach of protocol. Sarah noticed the slight movement and looked up at James with desperate eyes. She had heard that palace guards were trained in first aid and emergency response, and she hoped against hope that he might be able to help somehow. The look they exchanged lasted only a moment, but it communicated volumes about the urgency of the situation. The elderly man's breathing became labored, and Sarah could see that his color was getting worse. She knew they were running out of time, and that waiting for someone else to notice and respond might be too late. Her teacher's training had taught her to take charge in emergency situations, but this was unlike anything she had ever faced. Without thinking about the consequences or the appropriateness of her action, Sarah made an impulsive decision. She stood up from beside the collapsed man and walked the few steps to where James was standing at attention. The crowd around her seemed to hold its breath as they watched this unprecedented interaction about to unfold. James saw her approaching and knew immediately what she was going to do. Every fiber of his training told him to remain motionless and not respond, but his human conscience was screaming at him to help save a life. The moment stretched out like an eternity as Sarah reached out her arms. In front of hundreds of stunned tourists, dozens of cameras, and his fellow guards, Sarah threw her arms around James in a desperate hug. She whispered urgently in his ear, telling him about the medical emergency and begging for his help. Her voice was shaking with emotion and fear for the elderly man's life. The crowd gasped audibly as they witnessed this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. Cameras clicked frantically as tourists captured what they assumed was either a massive security incident or an incredibly brazen tourist stunt. No one except Sarah and James understood the life-or-death urgency that had prompted this dramatic action. James felt Sarah's desperation through her embrace and heard the urgency in her whispered plea. He looked over her shoulder at the collapsed man surrounded by concerned onlookers and made the most important decision of his career. Protocol and ceremony suddenly seemed far less important than a human life hanging in the balance. For several seconds, James remained perfectly still despite Sarah's embrace, and observers began to assume he would simply ignore her action and maintain his professional composure. The ceremony continued around them, but all eyes were focused on this extraordinary interaction between the American tourist and the Queen's Guard. Then, in a moment that would be replayed countless times on social media and news broadcasts around the world, James did something completely unexpected. Instead of remaining rigid and unresponsive, he gently but firmly placed his hands on Sarah's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. The crowd fell silent as they witnessed this unprecedented response from a guard who was supposed to remain motionless under all circumstances. Even the other guards glanced over in surprise, though they maintained their positions and continued with their duties. James spoke quietly but clearly to Sarah, his voice carrying the authority of his training and the compassion of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. He told her to stay with the man while he called for medical assistance, and he assured her that help would arrive quickly. Without another word, James broke from his ceremonial position and strode purposefully toward the police officer at the palace entrance. His movement was swift and decisive, drawing gasps and murmurs from the amazed crowd who had never seen anything like this before. The other guards maintained their positions despite their surprise, trusting that James had good reason for his actions. Years of training and mutual respect meant they would support his decision, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Sarah rushed back to the elderly man, her heart pounding with relief that help was finally on the way. She knelt beside him again and told his wife that medical assistance was being called. The woman squeezed Sarah's hand gratefully, tears streaming down her face. Within minutes, the police officer that James had alerted was speaking rapidly into his radio, calling for emergency medical services. The efficiency and speed of the response showed the professionalism of the palace security system when properly activated. As paramedics were dispatched and the situation began to stabilize, Sarah looked back toward where James had been standing. He had returned to his post, but something had fundamentally changed. The rigid, statue-like figure had been replaced by someone who had chosen humanity over protocol, and the crowd sensed this transformation. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, their emergency vehicle pushing through the crowded streets surrounding the palace with sirens wailing. The crowd of tourists parted respectfully as the medical team quickly made their way to where the elderly man lay surrounded by concerned onlookers. Sarah watched with relief as the professional medical team took over the situation. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking the man's vital signs, administering oxygen, and preparing him for transport to the hospital. His wife stayed close by, holding his hand and providing the medical team with information about his previous heart condition and current medications. James had returned to his ceremonial position, but the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Tourists who had witnessed his unprecedented response were looking at him with newfound respect and admiration. Instead of seeing him as merely a tourist attraction or living statue, they now saw him as a real person who had made a courageous choice. The incident had disrupted the formal ceremony somewhat, but the other guards and palace officials handled the situation with professional grace. The ceremony continued around the medical emergency, with the understanding that human life always takes precedence over formal protocols and traditions. As the elderly man was carefully loaded onto a stretcher, he had regained consciousness and was breathing more steadily with the help of oxygen. His color had improved significantly, and the paramedics seemed confident that he was stable enough for transport. His wife thanked Sarah repeatedly through her tears, grateful for the quick thinking and compassion that had potentially saved her husband's life. Sarah felt emotionally drained from the intensity of the situation, but she also felt an incredible sense of accomplishment. Her decision to approach James had been impulsive and potentially inappropriate, but it had resulted in getting help for someone who desperately needed it. She realized that sometimes breaking rules was necessary when human life was at stake. The crowd began to disperse slightly as the ambulance departed for the hospital, but many tourists remained to witness the remainder of the ceremony. However, the focus had shifted dramatically from the formal pageantry to the remarkable display of humanity they had just witnessed from both Sarah and James. Word of the incident began to spread quickly through social media, as tourists shared photos and videos of the unprecedented Interaction between the American teacher and the Queen's Guard. The hashtag #GuardHug began trending within hours as people around the world learned about the story behind the dramatic moment. James completed his ceremonial duties for the remainder of the ceremony, but he was acutely aware of the changed atmosphere around him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd upon him, no longer seeing him as an impersonal figure, but as someone who had demonstrated genuine humanity when it mattered most. After the ceremony concluded and the guards were dismissed, James found himself facing questions from his superiors about the incident. Palace protocol had been breached, and there would inevitably be an investigation into his actions and their appropriateness, given his ceremonial responsibilities. Sarah remained in the area after the ceremony ended, hoping to have a chance to speak with James again. She wanted to thank him properly for his response, and to apologize if her actions had caused him any professional difficulties. She understood that her desperate hug might have put his career at risk. When the guards were finally released from their duties, Sarah approached James cautiously. She was nervous about how he might react to seeing her again, given the unprecedented nature of their earlier interaction. She had no idea what the consequences might be for him professionally. James saw Sarah approaching and made the decision to speak with her, despite knowing that fraternizing with tourists was generally discouraged. The extraordinary circumstances of their meeting seemed to warrant an exception to normal protocols, and he wanted to know how the elderly man was doing. Their conversation began awkwardly, with both of them uncertain about how to address what had happened between them. Sarah immediately apologized for putting him in such a difficult position, explaining that she had acted purely out of desperation and concern for the man's life. James surprised her by expressing no regret about his decision to help. He told her that his training had always emphasized the protection of human life above all other considerations, and that he felt proud to have been able to make a difference in such a critical situation. As they talked, Sarah learned more about James's background and his reasons for joining the Queen's Guard. He shared his family's military tradition and his genuine pride in serving his country, but he also revealed his sometimes complicated feelings about the ceremonial aspects of his role. James, in turn, learned about Sarah's life as a teacher in Ohio, and her love for British history and culture that had brought her to London. He was impressed by her quick thinking and willingness to take action when she saw someone in need, even though it meant approaching him in such an unconventional way. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a palace official who needed to speak with James about the incident. Sarah realized that there might indeed be serious consequences for his actions, and she felt a wave of guilt about the position she had put him in. The official's demeanor was serious but not hostile, as he requested that James accompany him for a debriefing about the morning's events. James assured Sarah that this was standard procedure and that she shouldn't worry about the outcome, though privately he wasn't entirely certain what consequences he might face. As James walked away with the official, Sarah felt a deep sense of concern for the man who had risked his career to help save a stranger's life. She realized that their brief but intense interaction had created a connection between them that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Later that evening, Sarah received a call at her hotel from the hospital where the elderly man had been taken. His wife wanted to thank her personally and to let her know that the doctors had confirmed he had experienced a minor heart episode that could have been much more serious, without prompt medical intervention. The news that her actions had indeed helped save a life filled Sarah with a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. She realized that her impulsive decision to hug a Queen's Guard had been vindicated by the positive outcome, even if it had caused complications for James. That night, as Sarah reflected on the day's events in her hotel room, she couldn't stop thinking about James and wondering what consequences he might be facing for his decision to help. She had no way of contacting him or finding out what had happened during his meeting with palace officials. The story of Sarah's hug and James's response spread across the internet like wildfire overnight. By morning, news outlets from around the world were picking up the story, with headlines praising both the compassionate American teacher and the guard who chose humanity over protocol. Sarah woke to find her phone buzzing constantly with notifications from social media platforms, news websites, and even television producers wanting to interview her about the incident. She was amazed and somewhat overwhelmed by the global attention their moment of human connection had received. The videos and photos captured by tourists at the scene had been shared millions of times, with people from every continent commenting on the beautiful display of compassion they had witnessed. Many viewers were particularly moved by James's decision to break protocol in order to help save a life. Meanwhile, James found himself at the center of an unprecedented situation within the palace hierarchy. The meeting with officials had lasted several hours the previous evening, during which he had to explain his actions and justify his decision to abandon his ceremonial post. The officials were in a difficult position themselves. On one hand, James had clearly violated established protocols by responding to a tourist's embrace and leaving his assigned position during a formal ceremony. On the other hand, his actions had directly contributed to saving someone's life and had generated incredibly positive publicity for the palace. The public response to the story was overwhelmingly supportive of both Sarah and James. Social media was filled with comments, praising their humanity and calling James a hero for putting human life above rigid rules. Many people shared their own stories of times when they had to choose between following rules and doing what they felt was right. Palace officials found themselves fielding calls from news organizations around the world, all wanting official comment on the incident and James's status. The unprecedented nature of the situation meant there was no established precedent for how to respond to such massive positive publicity resulting from a protocol breach. Sarah spent her second day in London trying to avoid the media attention while still wanting to learn about James's fate. She had scheduled visits to several museums and historical sites, but found herself distracted and worried about the consequences her actions might have had for his career. During a quiet moment in the British Museum, Sarah's phone rang with a call from an unknown London number. When she answered, she was surprised to hear James's voice on the other end. He had managed to get her contact information through the hospital, where she had left her details when checking on the elderly man's condition. James told her that he was calling during his lunch break to let her know that the palace officials had reached a decision about his situation. Sarah held her breath, fearing the worst and preparing to hear that he had been dismissed or punished for his actions. Instead, James delivered unexpected news. Rather than facing disciplinary action, he had been commended by his superiors for his quick thinking and humanitarian response. The palace had decided that his actions, while technically a breach of protocol, demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character they valued in their guards. The officials had been influenced not only by the life-saving outcome of his actions, but also by the overwhelmingly positive public response to the story. They recognized that James had become a symbol of the human side of the monarchy and British institutions, which was actually beneficial to their public image. Sarah felt an enormous wave of relief wash over her as she learned that James would face no negative consequences for helping her. She had been carrying guilt about potentially ruining his career, and hearing that he was being praised rather than punished lifted a huge weight from her shoulders. James went on to explain that the palace had decided to use the incident as an opportunity to highlight their guards' training in emergency response and their commitment to public safety. Rather than downplaying the protocol breach, they were embracing the positive message about putting human welfare above rigid rules. The conversation between Sarah and James continued for nearly an hour as they discussed the surreal experience of becoming international news overnight. Both of them were amazed by how their split-second decisions during a medical emergency had resonated with people around the world. Sarah learned that James had been contacted by dozens of media outlets wanting interviews, but the palace had instructed him to decline most requests in order to maintain some dignity and avoid turning the situation into a circus. However, he had been given permission to participate in one carefully selected interview that would represent the palace's official perspective. James, meanwhile, learned more about how the incident had affected Sarah's vacation plans. She told him about the constant phone calls and interview requests she had been receiving, and how she was trying to balance her desire to share the positive message of the story with her wish to maintain some privacy. They discovered that they shared similar values about the importance of helping others and putting human welfare above personal convenience or social expectations. Their conversation revealed that their actions during the emergency had been consistent with their general approaches to life, rather than anomalous moments of heroism. As their phone call was drawing to a close, James surprised Sarah by asking if she would like to meet for coffee during her remaining time in London. He explained that he had been given some time off as the palace dealt with the media attention, and he would welcome the chance to continue their conversation in person. Sarah immediately accepted the invitation, thrilled at the prospect of getting to know better the person who had risked his career to help a stranger. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe away from the tourist areas where they might have more privacy. After ending the call, both Sarah and James felt a sense of excitement about their upcoming meeting that went beyond their shared experience of the emergency. They had connected on a human level during a crisis, and both were curious to explore whether that connection might develop into something more meaningful. The elderly man who had collapsed at the ceremony was recovering well in the hospital and had been following the news coverage of the incident. He asked his wife to try to contact both Sarah and James so he could thank them personally for their roles in getting him the medical help he needed. Through the hospital's social worker, the elderly couple was able to reach both Sarah and James with messages of gratitude. The man, whose name was Robert Harris, explained that doctors had confirmed he had experienced a minor heart attack that could have been fatal without quick medical intervention. The knowledge that their actions had definitively saved a life added an extra layer of meaning to the global attention their story had received. What had started as an impulsive moment of desperation had resulted in preserving someone's life and inspiring millions of people around the world. As Sarah prepared for her coffee meeting with James, she reflected on how dramatically her simple vacation to London had changed course. She had come expecting to see historical sites and learn about British culture, but instead had become part of a story that was touching hearts across the globe. Sarah arrived at the small cafe in Notting Hill 15 minutes early, her nerves mixed with excitement about seeing James again outside the formal setting of the palace. She had chosen a simple dress and comfortable shoes, wanting to look nice but not overdressed for their casual meeting. The cafe was exactly what James had promised: quiet, cozy, and away from the tourist crowds that might recognize them from the viral videos. Sarah found a corner table and ordered tea while she waited, watching through the window as London life continued its normal pace around them. James appeared at the cafe entrance precisely on time, looking completely different in civilian clothes. Without his red tunic and bearskin hat, he seemed younger and more approachable, though Sarah could still see the confident bearing that came from his military training. Their initial greeting was slightly awkward as they navigated the unusual circumstances of their friendship. They had shared an intensely emotional moment, become global news together, but barely knew each other as individuals. James's warm smile immediately put Sarah at ease as he settled into the chair across from her. Over the next 2 hours, they discovered remarkable similarities in their backgrounds and values. Both had grown up in close-knit families that emphasized service to others. Sarah's parents had been community volunteers, while James's family had a long tradition of military service. Both felt drawn to careers where they could make a positive difference. Sarah shared stories about her students and the joy she found in helping young people discover their potential. James talked about the pride he felt in representing British traditions and the satisfaction of knowing that his presence provided security and comfort to visitors from around the world. Their conversation flowed naturally from serious topics to light-hearted observations about their sudden fame. They laughed together about some of the more dramatic headlines that had emerged from their story, including one tabloid that had dubbed them the hugger and the hero. James revealed that palace officials had been surprised by the overwhelmingly positive international response to their story. The incident had generated more goodwill and positive publicity for the monarchy than any official campaign in recent years. Several palace staff had mentioned that they wished they could orchestrate more such authentic moments of human connection. Sarah learned that James had received hundreds of letters and messages from people around the world who had been inspired by his decision to prioritize human life over protocol. Many of the messages came from individuals who had been in similar situations where they had to choose between following rules and doing what felt morally right. The global attention had also brought some unexpected opportunities for both of them. Sarah had been contacted by publishers interested in her story, and James had received invitations to speak at military academies about leadership and moral courage in challenging situations. As their coffee meeting extended into lunch, Sarah and James began to discuss their lives beyond the famous incident. Sarah talked about her love for travel and her dream of writing a book about her adventures. James shared his interest in military history and his hope of eventually pursuing advanced education in international relations. They discovered a mutual love of literature, particularly historical fiction, and found themselves debating the merits of various authors and time periods. Their intellectual compatibility became as apparent as their shared values and moral instincts. The afternoon sun streaming through the cafe windows created an intimate atmosphere as their conversation turned more personal. Sarah found herself sharing her sometimes lonely life as a single teacher in a small town, and her dreams of finding meaningful work that would combine her love of teaching with her passion for travel. James opened up about the challenges of his unconventional career path and the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships when his professional life was so structured and demanding. He admitted that the incident with Sarah had made him reconsider some of his long-term goals and priorities. Their deepening conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other cafe patrons who recognized them from the news coverage. A young couple approached their table politely, asking for a photo and expressing their admiration for what they had done at the palace. Sarah and James graciously agreed to the photo request, but it reminded them both of their new reality as minor celebrities. They decided to take a walk through Hyde Park, where they could continue their conversation with more privacy. Walking through the park's tree-lined paths, James and Sarah continued to discover connections between their life experiences and future aspirations. The comfortable pace of their stroll allowed for deeper conversation about family relationships, career goals, and personal dreams. Sarah was struck by James's thoughtfulness and intelligence, qualities that hadn't been apparent during their brief emergency interaction at the palace. She found herself genuinely attracted to his character and curious about the possibility of maintaining contact after her vacation ended. James, meanwhile, was impressed by Sarah's independence, compassion, and sense of adventure. Her decision to approach him during the medical emergency had demonstrated courage that went beyond typical tourist behavior, and her subsequent handling of the media attention showed maturity and grace. As the afternoon wore on, both Sarah and James became aware that their time together was limited by her vacation schedule. She was due to return to Ohio in 3 days, and they both felt that their connection deserved more time to develop properly. The conversation eventually turned to the practical question of whether and how they might maintain their relationship across the Atlantic Ocean. Both acknowledged that long-distance relationships were challenging, but neither wanted to dismiss the possibility without exploring it further. James surprised Sarah by suggesting that he might be able to arrange some vacation time to visit her in Ohio before too much time passed. The palace had granted him additional leave as compensation for the media disruption to his normal duties, and he had been considering how to use that time meaningfully. Sarah was thrilled by the possibility of showing James her hometown and introducing him to her friends and family. She realized that she wanted to share more of her life with this remarkable man who had entered it under such extraordinary circumstances. As they walked back toward the cafe where they had started their afternoon together, both Sarah and James felt that their chance meeting during a medical emergency was evolving into something much more significant. Their initial connection forged in crisis was deepening into genuine affection and mutual respect. The sun was beginning to set as they exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for James's potential visit to America. Both felt that their story was far from over and that the hug that had brought them together might be just the beginning of a much longer journey. Their parting embrace outside the cafe was tender and full of promise, observed by evening pedestrians who had no idea they were witnessing the next chapter in a love story that had already captured hearts around the world. 3 months after their meeting in London, James stepped off the plane in Columbus, Ohio, carrying a single suitcase and a heart full of anticipation. The small airport was a stark contrast to the bustling international terminals he was accustomed to, but he felt more excited than nervous about this new adventure. Sarah waited at the arrivals gate, her face lighting up the moment she spotted James walking toward her. The months of video calls, text messages, and lengthy emails had maintained their connection, but seeing him in person again felt like a wonderful confirmation that their relationship was real and worth pursuing. The drive from the airport to Sarah's hometown gave James his first glimpse of American Midwest landscape. Rolling farm fields, small towns, and wide-open skies created a peaceful atmosphere that was completely different from his life in London. Sarah pointed out local landmarks and shared stories about growing up in this quiet corner of America. Sarah's small house reflected her personality perfectly, filled with books, travel souvenirs, and photos of her students and family. James felt immediately welcome in the cozy space that Sarah had created for herself. She had prepared the guest room for him, though both wondered privately how long the separate sleeping arrangements would last. Over the following days, James experienced American small-town life in ways he had never imagined. Sarah introduced him to her friends and colleagues, who were fascinated to meet the famous guard from their friend's viral story. The local newspaper even ran a feature article about his visit, complete with photos of him exploring downtown shops and restaurants. James was particularly charmed by his visit to Sarah's school, where her students were thrilled to meet a real British guard. He spent an afternoon answering their questions about palace life, British traditions, and his military training. The genuine curiosity and enthusiasm of the young Americans reminded him why Sarah loved teaching so much. The small-town hospitality overwhelmed James in the best possible way. Neighbors invited him for dinner, local business owners refused to let him pay for coffee or meals, and strangers on the street recognized him and stopped to chat about his story with Sarah. He began to understand the sense of community that had shaped Sarah's caring personality. Sarah treasured watching James experience her world and seeing her hometown through his fresh perspective, his appreciation for the simple pleasures of small-town American life. Friday night high school football games, farmers' markets, and neighborhood barbecues reminded her of the good things about her life that she sometimes took for granted. Their relationship deepened naturally during the 2 weeks of his visit. Evening walks through Sarah's neighborhood led to long conversations about their hopes for the future. Quiet mornings over coffee evolved into comfortable intimacy, as they learned each other's daily rhythms and preferences. James met Sarah's parents, who had followed their daughter's story in the news with pride and amazement. They welcomed James warmly, though Sarah's father couldn't resist asking detailed questions about British military traditions and palace security procedures. Her mother was more interested in James's intentions regarding her daughter's future. The most significant moment of James's visit came during a quiet evening on Sarah's back porch. As they watched the sunset over the Indiana cornfields, James told Sarah that he had made a life-changing decision. He had submitted his resignation from the Queen's Guard and was exploring opportunities to immigrate to the United States. Sarah was stunned by the magnitude of James's decision. She knew how much his military career meant to him and his family, and she couldn't believe he was willing to give up everything he had worked for to be with her. Her initial reaction was to protest that such a sacrifice was too much to ask of anyone. James gently took her hands and explained that his decision wasn't really a sacrifice at all. The incident at Buckingham Palace had shown him that his true calling was helping people in more direct ways than ceremonial duties allowed. He had been exploring opportunities in emergency services or private security work that would let him use his training to make a real difference in people's lives. More importantly, James told Sarah that meeting her had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never considered before. The connection they had discovered went far beyond their dramatic first meeting, and he couldn't imagine letting distance and career obligations prevent them from exploring where their relationship might lead. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she realized the depth of James's commitment to their future together. She had been afraid to hope for such a dramatic change, knowing how complicated international relationships could be. His willingness to start over in a new country for love was both terrifying and wonderful. They spent hours that evening discussing the practical aspects of James's potential immigration and career change. Sarah researched visa requirements and job opportunities while James contacted friends who had made similar international moves. The logistical challenges were significant, but not insurmountable for two people determined to be together. The final days of James's visit took on special meaning as they both realized this might be their last time together for many months while immigration paperwork was processed. They made the most of every moment, creating memories that would sustain them through the separation ahead. James's departure from Ohio was emotional for both of them, but it was tempered by excitement about their concrete plans for the future. They had moved beyond hoping their relationship might work to actively building a life together across 2 continents. 6 months later, James received approval for his immigration visa and work permit. His farewell ceremony with the Queen's Guard was covered by the same media outlets that had made him famous, though this time the story was about love conquering distance, rather than protocol being broken for humanitarian reasons. Sarah took a leave of absence from her teaching position to help James settle into his new life in America. They had decided he would initially stay in Ohio while he established residency and looked for work, after which they might consider relocating together to a larger city with more opportunities. James found work with a private security company that provided services for major events and public facilities. His military training and unique background made him an attractive candidate, and his calm demeanor under pressure, proven during the palace incident, was exactly what employers were seeking. The couple's story continued to inspire people around the world who followed their journey through occasional interviews and social media updates. Their relationship had become a symbol of how human connections made in moments of crisis could grow into lasting love with enough courage and commitment. A year after their first meeting at Buckingham Palace, James proposed to Sarah during a visit to the very spot where she had hugged him in desperation. This time, tourists gathered around them not because of an emergency, but to witness a romantic moment between 2 people whose love story had captured imaginations globally. Their wedding the following spring was a modest affair in Sarah's hometown church, but it attracted media attention from around the world. Robert Harris, the elderly man whose medical emergency had brought them together, served as an honorary guest and gave a touching speech about the power of compassion to change lives in unexpected ways. Sarah and James settled into married life in Ohio, where James established himself as a respected member of the community through his work and volunteer activities. Sarah returned to teaching, enriched by her experiences and with new stories to share with her students about courage, love, and the importance of helping others. Their story became a reminder that the most meaningful human connections often emerge from moments of crisis when people choose to act with compassion rather than convenience. The hug that had begun as a desperate plea for help had evolved into a lasting partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. Years later, whenever they told their story to friends or family, Sarah and James always emphasized that their extraordinary beginning had been less important than their ordinary daily choice to support and love each other. The viral moment had brought them together, but their commitment to building a life together had made their relationship truly special. The palace still displays a small plaque near the spot where their famous encounter occurred, not to commemorate the protocol breach, but to honor the reminder that behind every uniform and tradition are real people capable of remarkable compassion when it matters most.